I'm Katherine Woodfine. I'm the author of the Sinclair's Mysteries and the Taylor and Rose Secret Agent series, and I'm really delighted to be here today for this very special event with two brilliant writers of children's fantasy stories. So Dan Walker is the author of 3 middle grade adventures, Sky Thieves, Desert Thieves, and this year the first book in a new series which I have here, The Light Hunters. And also with us today is AJ Hartley, the New York Times bestselling author of over 30 books for children and adults. And his middle grade series includes 3 books, Monsters in the Mirror, which is this very splendid looking book here, The Miraculous Mission, and out this autumn, The Mirrors Shattered, all of which are beautifully illustrated by Manuel Šumberac. So today we're going to talk a little bit about monsters and magical worlds and writing captivating children's fantasy adventures. But to kick us off, Dan, do you want to tell us a little bit about The Light Hunters?
Yeah, that'd be cool. It tells the story of a young lad called Lux and his best friend Maya. And they live in a world where these huge monsters kind of roam the land, attacking towns and cities and villages. And Lux lost his parents to one of these monster attacks about 10 years before the story starts. And quite early on, his village, his town, gets attacked by one of these monsters, and it kind of thrusts him into a bit of a story where he learns that he has these special magical light powers. And he ends up going to this place where the light hunters live, this huge kind of Dawn Star, it's called, their base, and he learns how to be a light hunter, a healer in particular. And eventually he goes on to try and take on this monster which injured his parents. So, yeah.
Fantastic. And Strange Monsters is definitely something that you both have in common. Can we hear, Andy, a little bit about the Monsters in the Mirror books?
So the first book, Monsters in the Mirror, follows the story of an 11-year-old English boy called Darwen Arkwright, who moves to the US to live in Atlanta, Georgia with relatives. And when he gets there, he discovers, among other, he finds this old mirror shop, and where he is presented with a mirror, which he has the ability to go through. And when he goes through the mirror, he's into this other world, which is beautiful and strange and full of monsters that are trying to get out. And successfully, it seems. So he finds he's in a situation where he's the only one who understands that there's basically an invasion coming, and he has to figure out how to stop it and protect his family and his friends and so on, and his school from what's coming.
I must say, I really loved reading about Darwin's experiences of getting used to life in Atlanta, coming from the north of England. I'm here today in my house in Lancaster, which is obviously just a little bit north of Preston, which is where Darwin's from in the story. And I know you're from Preston yourself, and you now live in the USA. So was that element of the story inspired by your own experiences?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I've lived in the States for 30 years now, but and when I come home to England, people can hear that I don't live in the UK anymore. But here I sound like I'm British as far as Americans are concerned. And so I'm constantly having those, "You're not from around here, are you?" kind of conversations, you know. And simple things like, getting a decent cup of tea.
Well, I was thinking of this. I think it was the moment where you described the tea bag kind of floating in the tea like a dead mouse, and I just thought I knew exactly what you meant.
What is that about? I don't understand. They don't. The water's not hot enough. They put the tea bag in, and you're like, what is this? I don't. This is a drink.
So let's hear a little bit about the origins of these two stories. I mean, obviously there's a bit of real life experience in there. But for both of you, was there a kind of a particular germ or a sort of spark of imagination that was where these stories originated? Dan, how about you?
Yeah, there was, to be honest. I play a lot of computer games. Always have done since I was a little kid. And one of the things you get in computer games is something called classes. So you have a class of character. One might be a healer, one might be a tank, one might be somebody who does magic and sort of damage things. And I really liked this idea, and I didn't think we'd seen it too much in books up to now. And I really liked the idea of writing a character who wasn't hurting other things, but was actually healing them. And that's where the start of this book came from. And then that alongside this idea of these huge monsters. I like the idea of almost monsters like a force of nature, like a tornado or a hurricane, kind of coming into town, attacking everything, destroying everything, and then kind of disappearing again, and everyone having to pick up the pieces. And so it was those kind of two ideas that I put together with this magical force called light, this healing force, and then obviously the damage of the monsters that eventually developed into the story. Yeah.
And Andy, how about you?
Well, as you said, there's a lot about not belonging in these books, and I felt like in some ways I was sort of channeling my own experience of not just of living in the States and not really fitting in, but never really fitting in, and I think this is something that a lot of kids can relate to, that at some point in our lives we always feel like the odd one out. And that's what I wanted to be the core of these stories, and finding a kind of supernatural or fantastic frame to explore that idea of feeling separate, feeling different, and maybe there's a positive element to that sort of separateness and strangeness. And then finding ways, and this is particularly the case with the third book, where the world is now well established, and we're able to start asking other questions about how the situation came about in the first place and what's really going on. And in many ways, it's a more mature book, because instead of it just being pure adventure, there's a lot of adventure in it. It's also sort of a wrestling with these questions of, who am I? Who do I want to be? Right? Which is a core question, I think, for kids' books. Where we're sort of just starting to figure out the kind of adult we might want to be in the future.
And fantasy books provide such a great space to explore that. And I was really struck actually in both of the books by the fact that they seem to be very connected to those ideas, but also to the strong tradition of children's fantasy adventures, sort of exploring those kinds of spaces, going right back to C.S. Lewis and Narnia, and everything in between. So were you both readers of fantasy stories as a child? Is that something that sort of shaped your imagination as you were growing up? Dan?
Yeah, definitely. You literally mentioned one of the books that inspired me massively when I was a kid there. The whole Narnia series just really caught my imagination when I was young. So I love those books, and they got me started. The ideas of almost that mythological idea that kind of goes through them, the biblical stuff, people being turned into stones, this snowy landscape, lions, talking kings, etc. But I also really loved Tolkien, so The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And The Hobbit was a big one for me. And I guess that makes sense when you think of Light Hunters, that huge dragon that sits in the mountain, sort of guarding the treasure, immense danger to Rivertown. So yeah, those two books, those two series in particular, had a big influence on pretty much everything I've done since. Yeah.
And Andy, I could see you nodding away there. Is that true for you as well?
Yeah, he stole my answer. Yeah, I was raised on the same stuff, and the Monsters in the Mirrors books are very clearly, descendants of those traditions. It's portal fiction, right? It's that idea that you leave the ordinary world behind, you go into this other world, and you have adventures, and then you come out of it. Now, part of what I wanted to do with the Monsters in the Mirror books is to say, what happens if you go into the other world and it's so dangerous that you can't stay there, and you've got to keep coming out? So you can only go in periodically. So the books are then more grounded in conventional reality, but there's still that sense of the strange other world on the other side and what might come out of it, right? And I would add, absolutely, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And then for me, the next big one was Ursula Le Guin and the Wizard of Earthsea novels and such, which that was the first time that it started to feel like the evil in fantasy wasn't all external. It wasn't the obvious monsters, but it was something that came out of the good guys, right? It was something somehow released, or some dark aspect of the hero, which was a real sort of revelation to me as an adolescent. Say, oh, well, maybe evil is not easy to see. Maybe monstrosity is not self-evident. Maybe there's something that is a bit more complicated that comes from ordinary people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such a brilliant example, and Ursula Le Guin does that so brilliantly in the Earthsea books. They're such a masterclass in what you can do, you know, with a story about wizards and magic, and
Yeah.
you know, really taking that and exploring it. I mean, obviously these books are sort of part of that like rich tradition of fantasy writing. But I was also kind of thinking as I was reading both of them about sort of film and TV, and Dan, you mentioned gaming as well. Are there particular films and TV series that have been real touchstones for you in your writing?
Yeah, I can, games particularly, like I said earlier, but there's definitely, going back to Tolkien, those Lord of the Rings films. I think I was probably about 16, 17 when they came out. And I'd never read Lord of the Rings up to that point. And then I went to the cinema, watched them, fell in love with the world, the green countryside, the huge mountains, everything like that. And I went home, obviously, and read them that Christmas, and then read them again. And those films had a big influence on me. A lot of the fantasy I like tells a story of moving through a landscape. I'm just reading A.J. Hartley's book at the minute, The Monsters in the Mirror, and I love that description of through the portal, the other side, that kind of moonlit forest. And I love that geography of fantasy books, and the Lord of the Rings films definitely influenced that for me.
And Andy, what about you?
I was a huge fan of those Lord of the Rings movies, and since I was born in the early 14th century, it felt like I was watching them being made for about 20 years. You know, I was one of those sort of hardcore nerds who, like, when the internet was invented, there were these little threads about the development of these films. There was a great site, I think it still exists, called, what was it called? Really Cool News. You ever heard of that? And for years they tracked the origins, the beginnings of those films, and they would leak little images, and all the fans would gather around and say, "Is this Saruman? What's going on here?" So yeah, those films were such a great realization. The Hobbit films less so, tragically, but yeah, that first trilogy was brilliant. But I you know, for me, growing up on Doctor Who, and I mean, like, 70s Doctor Who, Tom Baker and John Pertwee, and those were the Doctor Whos that I grew up with, and that sense of you know, battling monsters and developing a taste for the sort of blend of surprise and pacing and, you know, rumination, philosophy that emerges from those kind of stories. Yeah, I loved all that. I was also the kid who would, I would stay up late at night on a Saturday to watch like old horror movies and things like that. So that was all Hammer House of Horror. Remember those? Wonderfully terrible stuff.
I'm glad you mentioned Doctor Who, because that was definitely in my mind. But the other thing, and I have to admit, I did have a little poke about both of your websites to sort of find out a bit more about you before this chat. But the other thing that was in my head was Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Yeah.
I'm a huge Buffy fan, and I could definitely feel that sort of idea of all of these really cool monsters popping up that reminded me, especially of those early days of Buffy, when there was always like some sort of crazy creatures.
Yeah, Monster of the Week.
Yes, Monster of the Week, exactly.
Yeah, and the playfulness of that show, you know, that sort of constant, where character voices were sort of subsumed within a larger kind of ironic, that everybody had that kind of wit. It wasn't just a character or two. It was like the whole show. I loved that. And still the ability to raise really serious things while in that very playful world. You'll see I'm wearing my Firefly t-shirt.
Oh, excellent. So let's talk a bit more about monsters. How do you go about creating a really cool monster? Because obviously there is a huge amount already out there in TV, in films, in books, and all the places we've talked about. So how did you set about sort of imagining these kind of monstrous creations in your books?
Well, I mean, I can speak for myself that actually in the Light Hunters, the monsters that have appeared so far are actually monsters from our mythologies in our world, which is it's a bit of a strange thing to do in fantasy fiction, but I quite like it as well. So the monster at the end of my book, the big kind of battle at the end, is with the Cerberus, the hound of the underworld in Greek mythology. But taking back to what we were talking about earlier with Ursula Le Guin, a lot of the time creating a monster is also your bad guy or your bad girl or your bad thing within the story. And that can be really fun as well. So I think certainly when it comes to those human monsters, a lot of it is about where they've come from, why they're doing what they're doing, and making sure that makes sense. Because it's very easy to create a monstrous human character that's doing something for no reason. But if you can come up with a good reason that makes sense to the reader and to them as to why they would be doing what they're doing, I think that's a really important thing. But yeah, for me, I've sort of plucked monsters from our world and popped them into a fantasy world.
Andy, how about you?
Well, I mean, I think as Dan says, you know, there's something fascinating about the monsters that emerge from our own mythology, and often they're sort of weird hybrids, right? You know, there's something recognizable about them, which is then either connected to something else or twisted. I mean, you mentioned like the three-headed dog or something like that. Which a dog is recognizable, but the moment you give it two extra heads, it becomes not just scary because there are more mouths, it becomes unsettling because it makes us feel like there's something wrong with the world, right? And that sort of so I'm fascinated by that idea of the uncanny, right? Of something which is familiar but just a little bit wrong.
The beauty was that for me when I was younger. The snake's hair, the stone gaze, that always terrified and fascinated me when I was a kid.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, and so the idea of, and it makes a kind of sense, but not really, and it's that sort of nightmare image where things don't behave the way that they're supposed to, and I think, you know, as to try and find your way into those kinds of things, and and to identify what the function of the monster is the key to creating them, right? So you say, well, what do I want to get from this? Is it a sort of visceral, gut level creepiness? Or is it something simpler, and to try and remember what it was that frightened us when we were kids? And, you know, adults are frequently frightened by the same things that they were. I mean, you know, since you're Northerners, I can reference the fact that in the second Monsters book, one of my key monsters is actually the laughing clown at Blackpool Pleasure Beach. Which scared the daylights out of me when I was a kid, you know? And it's this sort of recurring image of something just not right.
I think in your book, Andy, I won't give too much away, but there's a shadow, let's describe that in your book. I'm not quite at the end, but I'm very close to the end. And there's a section where your main character runs into the shadow properly for the first time. And I thought that was absolutely brilliant. This idea of it just being completely surrounded by darkness with nothing, no options, no plan, no idea of what to do because there is no light there.
And no air, right?
Yeah.
It's like running into space, into a vacuum or something.
Yeah. Absence, yeah.
And again, that's such a kind of a classic fear, isn't it? You know, it really plays on something that you know we all find terrifying.
Right, we're all afraid of the dark, but imagine if the dark can come after you.
Yeah. I thought it'd be useful to talk a little bit about how you go about your writing, for anybody who's interested in writing fantasy themselves. So, tell me a little bit about the sort of world building side. How do you approach sort of creating a fantasy world?
I mean, I I think all authors do it differently, I'm sure. So you probably get a completely different answer from me that you would get from Andy. But I know when I'm doing it, the germ of the idea will come to me, and instantly you get a rush of sort of little ideas that branch off that. So places, the way things might work in the world, characters, anything like that. And then I start to plan my story, and that's where I really get into the world building side of it. So I will, the plot line will move one way, and you realize you need to set this up in the world. So you go back and set up a little bit earlier on and stuff like that. But again, once you've got that plan and you start writing the book, then it's like laying the track in front of you, and even more world building sort of comes to life at that point. And you build out the texture of the world, or at least I do at that point. And by the end of it, you've got a finished book. You see things that you did that you didn't realize you were doing, and then you try and bring those out, tease those out a little bit more in the second and third draft. But like I said, that's probably completely different to what Andy's going to tell you there.
I mean, for me, it varies from book to book. I mean, with the Monsters books, I kind of cheat in a way because the idea of the world on the other side of the mirror is really a network of different worlds, right? These locuses that are all connected sort of by these sort of semi-spiritual / pseudoscientific means of moving from one to the other. But it means that they can all be quite different and function according to their own different logics. So it's a great sandpit to play in, whereas if I was writing like a previous series that I did called Steeplejack, which was set in a world that looked like Victorian South Africa, and that was a totally different experience because that had to be thoroughly researched and built and absolutely consistent. And I think, and I think Dan was sort of suggesting this as well, the key to world building is making sure that there's a rule system, right? That whether it's built into the geography of the place or the social structure or whatever it is, you've got to have what writers often call a Bible, a document that creates all the things that we know to be true that you cannot break, right? Because there's nothing worse than a fantasy novel, or any kind of novel for that matter, that gives you a set of rules and then breaks them at the end in order to save the hero who's been painted into a corner by a writer who didn't know what he was doing.
And a reader will sniff that out instantly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we all know that children are the most, clear-sighted, the precise readers of all in that respect. They will not let you get away with anything. That's actually really interesting because it brought me through to what I wanted to ask you about next, which was about plotting. I'm in the middle of plotting a book at the moment, so this is probably in the forefront of my mind. But are you plotters when you write? Do you always know exactly what's going to happen in each part of the story? Or is there an element of kind of, the story taking shape as you go along?
I definitely am. My first book, I just wrote down a list of bullet points of cool things that I thought could happen in a kid's book. And then I had a rough idea of how plotting went and sort of wrote it and got lucky. But since then, I've delved a lot into structure of stories, and it's something I'm really, really passionate about. So I tend to plot in a lot of detail exactly what's going to happen, start writing it, and then obviously completely rewrite my plot as I go. But yeah, I love the mechanics of story writing. It's like clockwork when it's done well, and trying to get as close as you can to that perfect little piece of clockwork is what I really enjoy about storytelling.
Yeah, that's a lovely way of putting it. I know you. I wish that I could do that, and that sense of creating the perfect mechanism. I love that idea. For years, I didn't plot at all, which is why I couldn't sell a book. Because, frequently I'd write these things and I was taking a long time to write them, and I didn't really have a clear sense of where they were going. So they would frequently turn into something else. It's like reading something written by, a 6-year-old. It's like, and the spaceship lands and there's a velociraptor. And like, what are you doing? What is that? So I would write these books that frequently just didn't really know where they were going. So I learned the lesson when there was one novel that I couldn't sell, and I left it for a couple of years, and then I came back to it, and I was like, what is this? And I could cut almost the first 100 pages and have no impact on the story at all. Because the story didn't know where it was going. It's just like I'm making it up as I go along. So so I became a plotter, but not a detailed plotter. I mean, for me, a plot is a 10-page short story version of the narrative, and nothing ties directly. It's not like one paragraph equals a chapter or anything like that. And I'll have a premise, and I'll have a conclusion, and I'll have some sort of, here's how I think I get from here to here. But I still need to feel like I'm making discoveries as I go, so I don't like to get overly detailed. And at this point, I've done it enough that I feel like I can stay on track and then fix the holes in the first edit.
Yeah, you kind of know it whenever you've read lots of books and watched lots of movies and played lots of games, etc. Instinctively, you know when something's wrong with the story, which is why what you described a second ago is a brilliant thing to do. Just once you've written a story, leave it for a month or two, come back to it, and your gut will tell you pretty quickly where the problems are. And it's then a case of, fixing them, as you said, often by cutting stuff out.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice.
I think another good way to identify the problems is try to summarize the story to somebody who will be honest. And usually, as you start to try and explain what the story is, and they keep giving you this, what? Huh? Yeah, you've got a problem.
Mm.
So those are two, I think, very good concrete pieces of advice for anybody who's wanting to write fantasy or any kind of story actually for themselves. Have you got any other sort of top tips or specific pieces of advice that you give for somebody wanting to sit down and write fantasy for children?
Not for fantasy in particular, but I think the old cliched advice of try and do a little bit of writing every day works for a person like me. Now, that might be different for some people. Some people tend to work when they get that spurt, and they'll do 50 pages in a row and then nothing for a few days. I need that kind of regular writing, so I try and set aside a certain amount of time a day, sit down, rain or shine, problems, stress, whatever's going on. I need to make sure I get those words on the page, and anything after that I can kind of fix in the end when I'm editing it and redrafting. But consistent, regular writing, I think, was one of the best things for me in terms of helping me go from an amateur to someone who sells books and does it for a living.
That's really interesting. And I think, as Dan said to begin with, basically, I mean, there isn't a correct way to do this. I think that the right way is the way that finishes up with some sort of product, right? Where, when people say, oh, well, that doesn't work for me. It doesn't. I don't care what does or does not work, so long as you finish up with a book, right, or with a significant step towards a book. I don't write every day. In fact, I haven't written for months, and then when I do have an idea, I will write furiously, and I will usually shoot to do about 3,000 words a morning. So my first draft will be done in a couple of months. But I'll have long periods where I don't write at all. But, as far as general advice is concerned, I would say, above all, read a lot and write a lot according to whatever pace works for you. But make sure, maybe set long-term goals, right? Rather than say, I will write 500 words today. Maybe say, I will write 1,000 words within the next, no, I'll say I write 2,000 words within the next 3 weeks or something. I don't know. But so that you can keep yourself honest and check to see that you're actually doing it. But when you're reading, also read critically. When you're really enjoying a story, stop, put the book down and ask yourself what the book is doing that is working, that you can then use, that you can learn from. And when a book isn't working, the same. If you find yourself throwing a book across the room, ask yourself, why do I hate this so much? So that I never do that.
That last thing is hugely important. Yeah, I find it so hard to do. Once I get into a story, my brain just switches off and I'm like being flashed along by a wave. But yeah, it's massively important to just stop and have a quick think. What have they done there? Why did that work so well? Why am I feeling the way I'm feeling as a reader? And that, as long as you do that and apply it to the next book you write or the next story you write, you'll constantly be improving, which is probably the one thing you should be trying to do as a writer, which is not comparing yourself to everybody else or J.K. Rowling, but just doing better than you did last time. I think that's an important thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really helpful advice, and it works regardless of where you're at in the process, because we can all think about, you know, what we've done before and what we want to do next, and hopefully have that sort of feeling of growth. So on that note, can you tell us anything about what you guys have coming up next? Dan, do you think would you return to the world of the Light Hunters in future?
Yeah, definitely. I've got my planned my outline for the next one, so I'm really excited about going back to that one, and the characters as well, because in the first book there's sort of 3 or 4 characters that gather around the main character that I can't wait to explore a little bit more, and a few threads that were dropped into that book, which we'll think. But yeah, I'm currently writing something which is another fantasy book actually, which is much more what I would consider traditional fantasy, so something like C.S. Lewis, with knights and castles and fairy tale fantasy, which I'm really enjoying at the minute. So I'm sort of working on those 2 things in the background.
Fantastic. And Andy, how about you? Would you go back into Darwin's Adventures for any more, do you think?
No.
It's done.
I think it's done. I think, you know, I like to sort of get to a point where I feel like there's closure here, that there may be threads that I would be interested in pursuing, but at this point I've been separated from it for a little while, and in the same way that I get really excited about a project and work furiously on it for the amount of time that I'm working on it, when it's done, and it no longer belongs to me. It goes out into the world and I move on to something else, and I don't at the moment know what I'm going to write next. I have something involving TV going, which I don't know if that's going to go anywhere, but yeah, I don't know.
So the portal is closed for the time being.
Yeah, for the moment.
Fantastic. Well, that's been really great. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today, both of you. It's been brilliant, and I think some really, really good advice that in there for anybody who's interested in writing as well. So yeah, thanks so much for talking to me, and I hope everyone listening has enjoyed hearing about these fantastic stories full of monsters and magic.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.